Time with Kirk Cousins after the game. He was not that interested in diving into some of the criticisms that he's had in terms of coming up in big games and playing well. Went to see his family with him. After the game, we walked over to the buses. There were hugs and elation all around. And it seemed like basically he felt like, this was a big moment for him.
So we had a wild card weekend that had 2 overtime games and one that was wildly fascinating to me. New Orleans Saints versus the Vikings. We know that the Vikings won this game in overtime controversially. And we are joined by senior writer for Sports Illustrated, Greg Bishop, who was there and wrote a fantastic gamer about it. Greg, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
No, thank you for joining us, man. This is a treat. So I got to ask you, what were your thoughts immediately after Kyle Rudolph made his touchdown pass and it looked like offensive pass interference?
I think I was stunned more than anything at that point because, here you have a team in the Saints who have obviously lived through some really tortured history in the playoffs recently. They had the non-call against the Rams on the pass interference last year that basically cost them the game. 2 years ago, they had the Minneapolis Miracle for fluke play that cost them another playoff game. And, I was stunned in part because you can see Rudolph, at least engaged in his hands, whether we can argue whether it's a pass interference or not, but it sure looked that way. And then to see it go the Vikings' way and go against the Saints again, I was just totally in disbelief. And a part of me thought immediately about Cousins, who I've written about for years, simply because he's had this tag about him that's probably been fairly earned. He has lost a lot of primetime games. He has lost to a lot of teams with winning records. And here he was winning a playoff game, not just any playoff game, but on the road in New Orleans against Drew Brees, and because he played really well. And that pass, I think, was indicative of it.
He was in the locker room yelling, "You like that?" I mean, he was feeling pretty good about it. But also, the way that he played to start the game, it felt like this was all going to be for the Saints because he looked shook. He didn't look like he was ready for this. But he bounced back. And on the other hand, I saw Drew Brees' arm deflate in front of me. It felt like that might have been the last pass he might throw in the playoffs. Do you think that's true? Have we seen the last of Drew Brees?
I think he'll play again, but I do think that the thing that you just raised there is totally fair. Throughout most of this season, I think we've seen Drew Brees throwing shorter passes. He hasn't looked quite as good or quite the same as he has in recent seasons as he started breaking all these league passing records. I thought during the last month of the season he kind of overcame that. The Saints looked really scary again. I was of the belief that they had a chance to make the Super Bowl as the 3 seed, despite having to go on the road twice. And I think what we saw on Sunday was a Vikings defense that battered him around, that got to him, that put him under duress, and his yards per attempt went way down again. And so I think it's fair as we look at this offseason to look at, Drew Brees and Tom Brady and some of these guys that have, gotten up there. Ben Roethlisberger would be another one, and think that if we're not at the end right now, we're going to be at the end pretty soon. And, it'll be really interesting when that happens because these guys have dominated the NFL for so long. They're always in the playoffs. They're always deep into the playoffs. That we've really had this sort of golden era of quarterbacks, and I do believe that will change, and we're going to yield to another era, which looks pretty exciting in and of itself.
100%. I mean, I'm excited about the AFC side more than anything else, just looking at who's in it and how they got there. But about this Vikings-49ers game that's coming up, I didn't think that Kirk Cousins was going to be good enough to win this game, and he wasn't. Dalvin Cook had a lot to say about this, and this team looks so terribly different with him as the bell cow back. Do you think that's enough to beat this 49ers team that is one of the 2 best in the NFL this year?
I think the Vikings have a good formula that will keep them in a lot of games. I wouldn't expect them to go into San Francisco and win the way that they did in New Orleans, but I wouldn't be shocked by it either. This is a team that has a good running game that can hand the ball to Cook 20, 25, 30 times. This is a team that has a great defense. They've been built over a long period of time. Tons of great players over there. I thought Everson Griffin and Daniel Hunter, both played amazing on Sunday. And then I think, if Cousins is playing well, that's sort of the X factor, right? Like, will he make a debilitating mistake? Can he just sort of stay within the confines of the game plan, make the right throws, hit on a couple big ones like he did in overtime, like he did in the second half, to keep drives alive for them? I think that they have a team and a style of play that carries really well, and I think that they have a chance in any game in the NFC because I think all those teams are flawed. That said, when I look at San Francisco, I see probably the most complete team in the conference. You know, they have a ton of speedy running backs. George Kittle's been awesome. Jimmy Garoppolo has played better and efficiently as the season has moved along. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if San Francisco is a team that comes out of the NFC to face somebody in the Super Bowl. And so I would predict that 49ers win. I think the game will be closer than most people do. And I would imagine that Cousins could carry over some of what he did on Sunday into that game this weekend.
Thinking about one of those teams that you mentioned flawed in the NFC, I first put a team that popped into my mind was the Seattle Seahawks because I thought that the game would have been won by Philadelphia if Carson Wentz could play. That's how poor I thought Seattle was playing. On the flip side, they bring Skittles back, Marshawn Lynch, they're going to Green Bay. I would pick Green Bay in this. Would you?
Yeah, I would pick Green Bay as well, but this is another game. See, I think when you look at all these sort of NFC contenders, they all seem pretty flawed in one way or another. The Seahawks are pretty banged up right now. They've had real ups and downs on defense all season. Outside of Russell Wilson, they haven't been that dynamic, although, DK Metcalf obviously was on Sunday. And, I could see them going out there and winning. I think they have a style of play that's similar to the Vikings. The defense is a little worse, but they should be able to travel well. When I look at the Packers, I see a team that has looked really hard at various points during the season. They've had 3 or 4 games where they just couldn't get anything going on offense. They've had some real duds, and for that reason, I've always sort of looked at them as a team I don't think will make the Super Bowl. That said, they're playing at home. That said, they have Aaron Rodgers. There's a lot to like about those things too. So, I wouldn't be totally shocked if we come out of this weekend with the NFC and it's Seattle hosting Minnesota in the NFC title game. But I also wouldn't be shocked if it's Green Bay going to San Francisco and chalk holes this weekend instead of upsets.
The AFC feels like we're on a collision course for Baltimore and the Chiefs, with most people picking Baltimore, though that Texan team showed a lot of heart, and I was really into that game and how betting against Clemson quarterback down 16-0 seems to just be a fraught affair for most. Who would you pick to come out of the AFC?
I actually like the Chiefs a lot now. I met with Patrick Mahomes recently. I'll have a story on him out in the next couple of days. And one thing that he told me is that, he thinks they're better positioned to make a run this year than they were last year, even though last year they were the number 1 seed. I think that's particularly because their defense has really played well over the, since week 11 or so. And he told me that he thinks he's a better quarterback than he was a year ago, which I think, we've seen some injuries and some adversity that it maybe overshadowed the fact that he still threw for 4,000 yards in 14 games, which is pretty incredible when you give the idea that he had an injured ankle at the beginning of the year. He hurt his hand against New England, and his kneecap basically detached from his knee at one point against Denver. He told me he looked down at the kneecap and thought his season might be over, and instead, when they put it back into place, he felt good right away. I think the Chiefs are peaking at the right time. I think that, they're as talented as Baltimore, and I think that their defense gives them much more of a chance to go to the Super Bowl than they did last year, and they came, 1 overtime drive away from going then as is. So I like the Chiefs over the Ravens, but I think the Ravens are a strong team. It's obviously been fun to watch Lamar Jackson. I think what everybody's hoping for in that conference is that those two teams are going to be playing a week from Sunday, that we're going to be looking at one of them in the Super Bowl, and that we're going to be starting this idea of Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson going against each other for years and years and years. And I think that's a pretty cool prospect.
100%. And I kind of want to pivot to you personally, and my producer Patrick actually brought this up. You get to cover a lot, man, from Michaela Schifrin to Helinski's story to Ryan Shazier's story to covering this NFL playoffs. Do you pick your beat?
Yeah, the way that we do it is about half and half. So I try to do half NFL because we have a pretty large staff. Peter King had started this MMQB a few years back, and so there are a lot of bodies that we can kind of throw at stories. I try to focus on stories that people haven't heard before, whether it's Patrick Mahomes kind of detailing what happened in the second season, which should be up in the next couple of days, or whether it's something more off the beaten path, like speaking with Ryan Shazier's father about his faith and how it was impacted by his son's injury. I really appreciate you saying that. I'm always looking for different kinds of things, and I'm always trying to tell stories that will take people somewhere new. And so the other half of my time I spend writing about mental health or, crazy kind of other stories. And the job's a lot of fun. I can't complain too much.
Hey, Greg, getting back to the NFL, the Titans have, I think, been a unique story. Obviously, they were middling. They've had some times in the last few years. Obviously, a couple years ago they had beat the Chiefs in the playoffs and got to the divisional round. But they insert Ryan Tannehill, and this team does a really complete 180. They're kind of in a tough spot because I'm sure they'd love to have Tannehill back, but my man Derrick Henry also is a free agent, and you can't franchise both of them. So, I mean, did they give a big check to Derrick Henry? I mean, I know this team feels like Henry's more their identity, but they obviously started winning when Tannehill was put in.
Yeah, I think that's a great question because, Derrick Henry looked like the best running back in football over the second half of the season. He won the league rushing title, and he was much better when Tannehill was playing than when he wasn't. So I think you're a bit of a chicken or an egg there. Was it Tannehill easing some of the burden that allowed him to run that well? We've seen Henry obviously have huge games before, maybe not quite as consistently. And what do you sort of want your identity to be? Like the Titans seem like they're going to be a team that wants to run the ball, that wants to, be sort of a tough, ball control kind of team. And in that case, you probably start with the running back. But there's a caveat to that, and that's that, you're not going to win in the NFL without a quarterback. The Titans have seen that as well as anybody. And now that you seem to have found one, can you keep him in the fold? How much of a discount would he take? Could you get him in the mid-20s rather than over 30 like you're seeing for some of the top guys now? And then, I think they're going to have to make that kind of decision. In an ideal world, I'm sure they'd love to have both, but that's part of the beauty of the NFL. You're not going to be able to pay everybody. You're not going to be able to keep everybody. And when you strike something the way the Titans struck at the end of the year, can you keep it together? Like, that's as important as what happened on the field.
Greg, one more question for you before we let you go. Who's going to win the Super Bowl?
I like the Chiefs. And I think that the popular pick would probably be the Ravens, and I totally understand it. Teams have had trouble slowing them down all year. I think we've seen over the last month of the season that teams have done better defensively against Lamar Jackson. The Ravens had more turnovers. They haven't looked quite as dominant as they were early in the year. That's part of the NFL, teams reacting to schemes, teams plotting defensive counters. I think the Chiefs are peaking at the right time. I like Tyrann Mathieu and Frank Clark and the other guys they've added on their defense. And I think we haven't forgotten about Patrick Mahomes, but we've maybe forgotten just how good he is. This is a guy who's been in the league 3 years, who started for 2, and you could pretty easily make the argument that his first 2 seasons were the best of a starting quarterback in the history of the league. And because he throws so many no-look passes and sidearm deliveries, and we see sort of this magic all the time, we can kind of feel like that's routine when it absolutely is not. So I think the Chiefs have hit their stride at the perfect time, and I like them to win, in Miami next month.
Amen. And Travis Kelce is always open. Senior writer for Sports Illustrated, Greg Bishop. Thank you so much for joining us, Greg.
Thank you for having me.
Right. Very cool.